All right, what a beautiful day out there, huh, everybody? Hello and welcome. My name is Marina Dawn Wells. I am Assistant Curator of History and Culture here at the New Bedford Whaling Museum, and welcome to New Bedford and to the New Bedford Whaling Museum. It's such a pleasure this weekend to collaborate with the city and the Port Society to celebrate Herman Melville and his connection to New Bedford, made material in the wonderful new statue across the street on the beautiful grounds of the Seamen's Bethel. And also, in case nobody made this connection, it was this guy's 207th birthday this month on the 1st of August, so happy birthday to him. Also a reason to celebrate. So Melville, in case you hadn't heard, came to New Bedford in 1841, around the turn of the year, and he worshipped at the Bethel. He walked these same cobbled streets that you did coming here to the museum today. He smelled the same salty air, sometimes fishy air. And I like to think that he also listened to the shrieks of seagulls that were the ancestors of the seagulls who we see outside the window here today. So then in 1851, Melville writes this book that you might have heard of, Moby-Dick, of course, and it is in part inspired by scenes in this city that he experienced. And so while his book didn't experience great acclaim at the time, scholars, artists, and readers of all stripes began to recognize its sort of bizarre beauty in the 20th century. And no matter how you read this really kaleidoscopic novel in all of its sort of infinite interpretations, it does require that the reader walk down these cobbled streets of New Bedford, sort of meander around the city. So today, lots of readers have experienced the city, right? And here in New Bedford, we like to brag that every January, people from around the world brave blizzards and frigid temperatures to come read in our marathon. So Melvillians really travel from all over this terraqueous globe to come here and see and feel in Ham's words, and really experience what is an approximation of what Melville himself, or perhaps Ishmael, experienced here in storied New Bedford. So there are a lot of ways to engage with this ongoing connection between Melville and New Bedford. Shameless plug, we are running another virtual book club this fall out of the New Bedford Whaling Museum, featuring some of our wonderful scholars who are here today. So you can do that from wherever you are. Start reading now. The first meeting starts in September. And then, of course, every January, we have our big readathon, and you can join us back here for that. So as for this weekend, just in a moment, I will welcome up Naomi Slipp, our Chief Curator here, in conversation with Adrienne LaFrance, the Executive Editor of The Atlantic, and then I will return up here at 3:45 with these esteemed Melville scholars for a roundtable. And afterwards, we do invite you to stick around, have a drink, enjoy a cocktail reception with us. And this weekend also in New Bedford is going to be full of music and readings and more. So we're extremely grateful to be in collaboration with the city and other collaborators here this weekend. And really appreciate those of you who have traveled from afar for visiting our seaport during the celebration this weekend. New Bedford, in Melville's words, was in the summer sweet to see, with fine long avenues of green and gold. So we can sort of see through his eyes that image. So finally, as we celebrate the unveiling of this new sort of monument across the street, also just bringing us back to the words of Melville himself, a favorite quote from an infamous chapter, if you've made it through the text. "God keep me from ever completing anything," he writes. "This whole book is but a draft, nay, but the draft of a draft." So in the context of our gathering today, I think this is a helpful reminder that this celebration, this weekend, this statue, this is all just a beginning, right? Melville's cultural and literary presence in this city is something we'll continue to muse over for generations, perhaps, right? And like the patina on the statue, weathered by future winds and rains, Melville's legacy will continue to change, and it's really up to us here today and for the years to come to determine that legacy, which will never be complete. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. So good afternoon. My name is Naomi Slipp. I am the Douglas and Cynthia Crocker Endowed Chair for Chief Curator and Director of Museum Learning here at the Whaling Museum. Thank you for joining us for this special program, exploring the legacies of Herman Melville, Moby-Dick, and New Bedford. Today, I am thrilled to be joined in conversation by Adrienne LaFrance, the executive editor of The Atlantic. Previously a staff writer, she still reports regularly and writes about a wide range of topics, including political violence, technology, the Pacific region, American comedy, and culture. And we've come up with kind of a list of what we think are going to be some fun questions to talk through with each other and then with you. But really wide-ranging, thinking about publishing, criticism, and Melville's legacies. So, we're going to dive right in then.
Let's do it.
Okay. So, can you share with us, those of us who are not deeply embedded in the Atlantic's history, a brief history of the Atlantic and its founding for our audience?
Yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and that was such a lovely introduction, and I'm just so pleased to be here and really feel that this museum is a real sort of kindred spirit to the Atlantic, so it's an honor to be here. Our magazine was founded not far away in Boston in 1857 by a group of writers, transcendentalists, abolitionists, and the idea was really to, well, first of all, the idea of it being a writer's collective was somewhat radical in the sense that many magazines of the era, and there were many, and the Atlantic is one of few that's still around from that period, but they were often started by publishers and for business reasons or political reasons perhaps. And so the notion of a group of writers coming together for the purpose of advancing the cause and even sort of idea of American literature was unusual, and happily has persisted over many generations since then. Some of our founders included Ralph Waldo Emerson, Longfellow, James Russell Lowell, Oliver Wendell Holmes, people whose names you probably know. And Melville did, in fact, sign our founding charter. So we know that he kind of ran in the same circles that the Atlantic's founders did. But we can talk more about why he didn't really write for us.
All right. So you mentioned kind of a constellation of Boston's leading thinkers in the lead up to sort of the Civil War. And Melville was there for a moment. Where and how did Melville, as an author, as sort of a thinker and intellectual, fit within the circle of the Atlantic's founders, writers, contributors? Like, what was that kind of circle like?
Yeah, so he was definitely known to them, and Nathaniel Hawthorne we like to proudly claim as having been our Civil War correspondent. He was obviously a very popular novelist at the time, and someone who Melville looked to as, if not a mentor, but certainly someone he wanted sort of this intellectual relationship with, and had to some extent. And so the Atlantic's founders knew Melville. The sort of cosmic bad luck from my perspective is that Melville's literary career, certainly his novels, were on the decline just as the Atlantic was starting. So Moby-Dick, I mean, it's only a period of a few years. So Moby-Dick comes out in 1851. The Atlantic is founded in 1857. One of our early, I can't remember if it was our early editor or publisher, but one of the early figures who was starting the Atlantic did ask him to contribute, and this was sort of surprising perhaps to the literary world at a time when Melville's reputation was not at its height. And his reaction was sort of, for those who know the Bartleby, one of his short stories, was very Bartleby-esque in the sort of, I'd rather not to. And so he didn't contribute then, and he was, moving a little bit more into poetry, but he definitely knew all of the players, and at least sort of supported the idea of this magazine if he didn't want to contribute to it.
Thank you. So you foreshadowed this, but was Melville published in the Atlantic?
No, so this pains me because we, as editors today, are constantly sort of looking to our past to ask the question of like, what great writer are we inadvertently rejecting, or like, what terrible mistakes are we making? I think about this all the time with Charlotte Perkins Gilman, was someone who pitched to us and we rejected, which was a terrible mistake on behalf of my predecessors at the Atlantic. But it really, I think, it was just sort of this bad luck of like Melville's career faltering, and to put a finer point on that, first I should mention I'm not a Melville scholar, so I'm very happy you all will hear from actual scholars. This is really just journalism is my expertise, but his reputation had tanked so thoroughly. I think this is important to understand the context that tabloids maybe, so this wasn't generous coverage, but people thought he had gone insane. So like at a time when headlines are in newspapers in New York and elsewhere saying like Melville's crazy, his latest work is unreadable, that kind of thing, that's when the Atlantic is just coming out. And I should mention, obviously the Atlantic is the center of my world, but back when we started, there were many more better established literary magazines, and so it was sort of just this radical startup that he may have thought, like, yeah, I'll support my friends and tell them good luck with your magazine, but it's maybe not worth my time. We don't know exactly what he was thinking, but we know he was going through a difficult period in his writing career, and the timing just didn't match up.
That's great. That's interesting to think about Charlotte Perkins Gilman almost making it in that, right? All right, so I have a kind of critical fabulation question for you to imagine with us. If Melville were on your roster of staff writers today, what assignments would you give him in the contemporary world?
It would be a dream. I have so many questions for Melville, but no, I mean, I would be really interested. So for those who have read Type P or some of his pre-Moby-Dick work, part of why I personally am drawn to Melville is his connection to the Pacific, and I spent part of my career in Hawaii and really care deeply about that history, and have always been interested in the extent to which he was one of the main figures who brought that part of the world back to the East Coast to help people understand it. That work is a product of its time in many ways, but it also, in its own time, he was really critical of missionaries who were going to Hawaii and elsewhere in the South Pacific in a way that wasn't really seen as acceptable down on the East Coast. And so I would love to have him write about the Pacific, and it's hard to imagine, what you would think of him today, so much has changed. But I do think it's hard to sort of resist the urge to go to the theme that he has written about so well, but I'm sure he would have interesting things on topics I can't even imagine. But I would love to hear his thoughts on the Pacific further.
That's great. And I'm curious, this is a little off script, but just thinking about kind of the really critical feedback that Melville received in publications, right, including of Moby-Dick. What kind of conversations do you have in your editorial room about the role of criticism and civility? Like, where are we today in terms of journalism with, giving a real serious review of things, but maybe also, yeah.
Yeah, it's such a good question. So, well, I should note too that Melville, we did review Melville, and so a collection of his poetry, one of our writers sort of infamously panned, which I think he probably didn't like. And part of the Atlantic's mission has always been, a focus on the literary and criticism as an important form to uphold, and that's still true today. So we have a really robust books section, and we really believe in reading our. There's stacks of Atlantics over there for anyone with our latest cover story. Our last cover story was all about the decline in reading, so this remains a preoccupation for us. And then in terms of how we think about how you approach criticism and in a way that serves humanity and elevates the discourse and is honest, so maybe not always nice, but still, we talk about this all the time, and I think generally, I'm sure everyone who's been on the internet has noticed, like, the sort of debasement of our ability to disagree in public. It is, to me, quite alarming. I think one of the key parts of our magazine's mission is to be a place, and this has always been true since the beginning, to be a place for diverse perspectives, for people to disagree, sometimes strenuously, or even to criticize one another's thinking, as long as it's fact-based, respectful. We don't ever want to be snarky or ad hominem or anything like that. But I do think it's a really important role for us to uphold, to say, look, we're not always going to agree, and not only is that not a bad thing, but we have to figure out how to disagree publicly, respectfully with one another. So I don't know if that answers your question, but we talk about it all the time.
Yes, yeah, and I think to your point, right, there are places where it's not always maintaining that civility. So it's important to think about the significant role that debate should have, and that we should be receiving lots of different viewpoints on things, but we can do it and train others to be able to have those challenging conversations too, right?
I also think when it comes to literary criticism in particular, that we talk about this sometimes too, where occasionally someone will say, well, we thought about reviewing this book, but it really wasn't very good, so we're not going to. And my instinct is always like, well, if it's not good, you can always say that too. So the impulse to be too nice doesn't necessarily always serve people, as long as the criticism is thoughtful and, really engages with the work and isn't gratuitously mean or anything like that. But at its best, criticism is a way to try to advance the ideas put forth in any work, and that in itself is, especially again in an age where people are reading less, just to demonstrate publicly that should be done, and that we should be talking about other people's ideas and what they write, I think is really important.
Well, and there's so much to be learned, right? Whether the book is quote unquote good or not good, I think it's that bigger question of why. Why do you think this is worth reading or not? That can be just as interesting.
Totally.
Okay. Back to script. What does it mean at the Atlantic, maybe like institution writ large, and for you kind of personally, to have abolitionist roots, to kind of come out of that history?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So, it's a part of our history that we're very proud of. Two of the sort of defining characteristics of the Atlantic from the beginning that we still talk about all the time with our own editorial staff today are the founding abolitionist story, which I'll get into in a minute, and this notion of being of no party or clique. So those two things, the reason I bring up both is they go together in the sense that we were founded by a group of people who believed that as writers we have a sort of obligation, and certainly in this magazine we have an obligation to center everything we do around sort of the dignity of humanity and advancing the cause of that sort of a moral cause for dignity, but to do that in a way that doesn't align ourselves entirely with anyone, whether it's political party or activist group. And so it can be difficult because everyone knows what politics are like today, and you can make a moral case for any number of things that often come into tension with one another. And so at the same time, it was very clear that our founders were anti-slavery and that they believed that a magazine should exist to advance that cause. I will point out, and it's funny because we were just walking along, there's a reference to the Emma Lazarus poem that's inscribed at the base of the Statue of Liberty, a work of art near the water. And I was just walking by and thinking about this because as proud as we are of our abolitionist roots, the Atlantic has been around for a really long time, and we've gone through all sorts of phases and published all sorts of pieces that anyone could debate, even today, that, does this serve the original mission? Does it serve our mission today? What actually is within the acceptable parameters of debate? And it's a really hard question to answer, especially when you're bringing in as many people with as diverse views as possible. And so it's a very proud part of our history that we are proud to talk about, but we also try to remain sort of radically humble in the sense of knowing that, you're making multiple editorial decisions a day, and you are going to make mistakes. And when we look back in our own archives, the reason I mentioned Emma Lazarus is we ran a poem right shortly after that poem existed that was sort of like a counter to Emma Lazarus and argued very much against the idea that America should be open to people seeking refuge. And so, not to take any position on immigration necessarily, but we went through like a eugenics phase at the Atlantic. There's a lot of material that was published that today we look at with some degree of horror, but I think that's part of why we're so focused on history as a way to inform the way we think about both our mission and the world today, because we have to understand, and with some degree, again, of humility, that, you know, whether it's 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years from now, we may look back on what we're doing now and think, what were they thinking? And so, I don't know if that totally answers your question, but.
Yeah, no, it very much does. And certainly here at the museum, we're consistently looking back at our own history, right? And thinking about the choices that have been made in the past, and exhibitions, and, you know, exclusions, and all the positive and things that maybe we wish had been a little different. But I think, to your point, so much of the projects that we take on, right, are exploring some of the thornier parts of our history and trying to contextualize and understand, like, why was somebody publishing a poem that was against immigration, right, in that period, right? Or what was happening within the larger eugenics movement and internationally? Like, those, I think, are really fascinating, interesting stages for being able to have conversations with people about things that are happening today as much as they are in the past.
I totally agree. And we talk a lot about, with our editorial team, we talk a lot about the need to always run toward complexity. So it can be very easy and sometimes really tempting to say, like, this was bad, or this is bad, or no, or, you know, just like to make things as clean as possible. But reality is messy and complicated and nuanced. And certainly when you're judging the actions of people generations ago, there's context. And so yeah, we try to run toward things that are as complex as possible.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so you hinted at this, right, and kind of always thinking about reading in the most recent cover story that you had in your last issue. So what is, in your opinion, the state of writing and reading today?
So I have a sort of mixed answer to this, which is, on one hand, there are all sorts of scary threats to reading and writing. You could look at just the number of distractions we have, the screens that probably all of us or most of us have in our pockets right now, or at least I do, and just like this, the sort of being inundated by information, which so there, and AI, we'll get into that if you want. So there's a lot to dismay about, but at the same time, I really do see that we're in this like super abundance of information. It can be chaotic and difficult to wade through what's real or what's true, but the access to knowledge is, because of the same technologies that are complicated for a million different reasons, is more profound than anything humans have ever experienced. So there's good, there's some good too. But my actual, I mean, this is I came to the Moby-Dick event in January, which was my first time, and I'm sure many of you have been, but if you haven't, please go. It's truly like the most amazing event. I'm so obsessed with it. And the thing that I left thinking, well, and so part of, you have people reading aloud, and then you also, over the course of the day, more and more people are sort of beginning to line the hallways, and they're lying there with their books and quietly reading together. It's just this like most beautiful, like I left being like, oh, humans are, like, we're gonna be fine. Like, if people come every year and want to read Moby-Dick quietly together while lying on the floor of a museum, like, first of all, these are my people, I love them. And also, like, this is a really good sign about maybe the world of readers will shrink. I mean, I think we have to be realistic that when novels first emerged, they were seen as like possibly being brain rotting, and there was a whole cultural, we had to figure them out as a culture. And novels are no longer the dominant way that we entertain ourselves, and that's okay. And also, I think reading is crucially important, and obviously I'm partial to writing as well. And I think that even if the group of people who obsessively care about literature and reading grows smaller or changes over time, I have no doubt that those people are still with us and will continue to be with us, and that parents of young kids are still raising readers. So I feel actually quite optimistic about it, but I think that it's going to require effort for those of us who care about literature to keep, lifting it up.
Yeah, and I think as you were sort of describing that, I was also drawn to think about, as you're saying, sort of the good and the bad, right? And that question of access and accessibility, right? And in how much we now have at our fingertips in terms of, extraordinary literature, and also maybe the zine that someone is writing, a couple cities away. And whereas in the past, you might have, needed to somehow find a reference to that to be able to subscribe to access it, right? Self-publishing, the kind of world of publishing in general, right? The platforms where you can find access to literature of lots of different kinds has sort of exploded.
It's true, and it's, I definitely am among those who lament the decline of daily newspapers. I think that's bad for society in a number of ways, but you're absolutely right that young people, like the impulse to create and share information and write and show other people you're writing, like that hasn't gone away, and you do see, like I talk to young people, not even journalists, but people who have started their own zines, the culture has fractured such that it may be harder to find those upstarts, or it's just the path for journalists certainly has changed. But with the right sort of creative spirit and stick-to-itiveness, which is what you always need as a writer, like that's still happening for sure.
Yeah, I think I have a 7-year-old, right? And like the graphic novel Craig's Dog Man.
Like the whole thing.
I'm curious, again, this is a little bit off script, but I know we have plenty of time to chat. Can you talk a little bit about how the Atlantic has met the moment? Like how you've diversified your information streams? Like you're not only print now, right?
It's true, we're not only monthly, and we have a website and an app and all the rest. Yeah, I mean, so I've been at the Atlantic for going on 14 years now, which is surprising to me. And it's changed even in that time. And so, I mean, we joke around, actually, it's sort of funny, I think about this in the summers, that I've read old editors' notes, even from like as semi-recently as the 1970s, where the editors talk about being off for the summer and they go fishing for the summer and don't think about journalists. Like it's just, so the information environment is totally different. None of us are going off fishing for the summer, although that sounds nice. And so there is this, just the demands of the news cycle are extreme, let alone we can get into like the substance of what's happening in the world, obviously. And so yeah, it's not, we talk a lot about what it means to be sort of like a real-time magazine or a fast magazine, and the format, I mean, I'm deeply devoted to print, and we're only actually growing our print magazine, we're making it thicker, which in heavier, which always feels good to me, which is great, but the goal is to just, do the work that gets to people in whatever form the story deserves, and sometimes that's a podcast, sometimes it's a video that we put on YouTube. Usually it's a written article, but we do, there's all kinds of tools and technologies and formats that are fun to play with. But yeah, so like the format can change, but yeah, the biggest change I think over the years is just the real-time nature of the work.
But the commitment is still there, right? No matter the vehicle, which I think is, yeah. So opportunity, right? Okay. The second question, kind of coming out of that, what is the state of writing and reading? Can you talk a little bit about what people read, what they want, how you think about your audience for The Atlantic, especially as executive editor? Like, I assume, and maybe you can explain what that means. Like, are you just receiving pitches all the time? Do you have like a stable of writers that, what does that look like?
Yes, I should explain. So I oversee our editorial team. I report to our editor-in-chief. So together we run all the writing and journalism at the Atlantic, which is most of it, yeah. And then in terms of our writers, we do have a growing stable of staff writers, and we are publishing them. I mean, most of our attention is focused on helping those writers get the ideas they have into the world in the best possible form that serves what they, what the work that they want to do. We also do work with a lot of freelancers, and so it really depends. Like in any given moment, and tell me if I'm going too deep in the weeds at any of this, but when we're trying to figure out what to cover, it's a mix of, again, I earlier referenced that we see ourselves as a writers collective, and so we really do pride ourselves on bringing in talent and saying, like, we're not, if you work at a newspaper, often you're thinking like, okay, I need this many reporters to cover the White House, and I need this many reporters to cover to be on the business desk or whatever. And we do have, we're an organization, we have to have sections, but we really are much more capacious in terms of how we think about what any one person does. And so when we're recruiting for writers, we're looking for just great brains, great minds. And you might think like, oh, this person has written brilliantly about this subject elsewhere, we'd love for them to do that here. But we really try to tell our writers that we want them to come in and lead us to their curiosities, and that if they're obsessed with something or preoccupied by something, there's probably a reason that we should be too. And so, it's not totally herding cats in the sense that we do, there are certain things we have to cover, especially in a moment, a news moment as demanding as this one. And so sometimes it's just like, oh, you know what? We need reporting on the Air Force One situation. Like, that's weird, let's figure it out. But very often we're more in a role of trying to ask our writers, like, what are you obsessed with? How can we make the best possible version of the story that you most want to tell in this moment?
That's great. And then, so So you've got a writer who comes to you with a pitch or story, and you're excited about it, and you're like, okay, that's great. How are you thinking about the audience of that story that gets to you? Like, can you tell us who are your readers? What do you see that they're reading? How do you know what they're interested in? That seems like a crystal ball.
Well, I mean, a lot of it is just instinct and guessing, and hopefully we're right. Sometimes we're not. We're not as metrics obsessed as some other outlets. So in the media business, there are a lot of people who would, want to do audience surveys and want to be sort of responding to whatever, like if this thing is getting the most readers, like let's keep doing that. And there's of course a good reason to do that, and we want people to read The Atlantic and love it and be interested in it. But we also feel pretty strongly that you don't want to go so far in the direction of optimizing for reader interest that you lose sight of what you need to do. So the classic example of this is like, if we only did things that everybody clicked on, then you might not cover poverty or some other very serious and important issue that you need to cover. That being said, we want people to read everything we cover, and so if something's not connecting with readers, our hope is that it's not an issue with the story, but we just haven't figured out how to distribute it the right way. So, but all of that being said, I mean, we have a very diverse and growing audience, and something I don't know what numbers we've made public, but we have roughly 1.5 million subscribers, which makes us the biggest magazine in America, which we're very happy about. There are more magazines still thriving, but we have a really devoted, large subscriber base, and they're from all over the country. I think some of that follows sort of what you'd expect population-wise. So we have a lot of readers in the Northeast and in New York and California. It's a very large state. So we're, a lot of coastal readers, but also people from across America too. And one thing I'll say too is how we know what people respond to is they tell us, and we love to hear from people. So we'll hear like, oh, like you ran this piece and I hated it, but fine, I'll still subscribe anyway. Or I love this piece, more of this please. And we do pay attention to that. And we ourselves are readers of The Atlantic. So a lot of it is thinking about what we are wondering about or curious about or what we feel like we haven't seen elsewhere. The one other thing I'll say about that too is we really do have what I think of as a luxury to be selective. So we're not a daily newspaper, we're not the paper of record. We don't have to do homework, we don't rush to sort of match scoops from other outlets, but we do, we want to do as much as we possibly can in as big and ambitious a way as possible, but a big part of excellence for us is knowing what we don't do, because that then gives you the time to focus on the things that you do want to focus on.
Yeah, and that's so important, right? To hear where I was thinking about, is it in our mission? How does it fit with what else we're thinking about and doing? So that's great. And I just want to repeat that because it's kind of extraordinary. In 2026, you have well over 1 million subscribers, right? And your subscription growth for a print magazine is going up.
Yeah, we're working really hard. So, but we're not always knocking on wood, and we never take our success for granted. But it's trending in the right direction.
That's great. Okay, we're gonna circle back to Melville. I'm sort of curious here. Melville can sometimes be quite dense. His descriptions can be a little opaque. His sentences, perhaps, confound modern editorial precision. What are your thoughts then on the role of Melville in today's world?
Well, I mean, I think, so yes, he can be a challenge, and I'll say I reread Moby-Dick for the first time since high school, I think 2 summers ago. I'm looking at my kids because they saw me hauling this novel around all summer, like, I have to read Moby-Dick. And there were times when it was hard to get through. I mean, it's such a fabulous book, but it is not easy. And I think if you talk to, actually, I have a dear colleague of mine who I will make come to this museum with me some days. Actually a historian who taught a course about Melville, and so he's truly the Atlantic's Melville expert. But yeah, he was saying, I was asking him for his thoughts on The Confidence Man, which I don't know if you have read, but was not critically acclaimed, and he sort of confessed to me, when I'm not sharing this out of turn, I think he would tell you guys too, but he was like, it's totally unreadable, I don't understand it, and I'm a Melville scholar. So yes, challenging, but I am of the opinion that challenging is good. Not necessarily, maybe not every sentence is good in the if it prose wise, but no, I think like that's part of what made Moby-Dick in particular such a radical novel at its time, is it really like exploded the idea of what the novel was. And I think some scholars, certainly who I've talked to, some Melville scholars have said that that's actually part of why it was better appreciated like in the 1920s, because all of a sudden the rest of the literary world had caught up to this concept of the novel that Melville imagined so far before anybody else. So I may have gone off track, but yeah, it's dense, it's hard. But I also recently, I'll just tell one anecdote because I love George Saunders. I don't know if you all have read him, but he's wonderful. And I spoke with him recently because he has a new novel out. And I was asking him about like, how does he feel about the AI of it all? And he basically was like, has no patience for people who don't want to read hard things, and was like, or write hard things for that matter. And he was sort of like, okay, so it's a struggle, so what, then struggle. And I think about that all the time, that like, like not everything has to be easy, and this part of our culture that is so obsessed with optimizing and being productive and maximizing and whatever, it's just like, no, read a hard novel and it can take a while, and that's okay.
Right, and it's the journey that is the journey. Right? You get somewhere at the end in lots of ways. So then I think picking up on that, because you've hinted at it a couple of times, I am curious, coming out of sort of imagining Melville and the style of his writing and the way he writes, and in fact framed a little bit by, I'm not sure if some of our summer interns are here. At lunch we were having a chat, and some of them were talking about the challenges of AI and how it is kind of overtaking things, and originality is sort of at threat perhaps. So I'm curious where you see, especially being a technology journalist, where technology is in terms of writing, editing, reading, and if, may I propose this, like, is Melville a sort of an antidote or answer to the kind of current intellectual climate when it comes to writing and reading?
I mean, I think so. I think this goes to the question of like, it's okay to read the hard things, which is very much not the mentality of those who want to outsource. What I would say, you shouldn't outsource to AI. So in terms of how good or the AI itself, like it's remarkable technology. I hope it cures cancer. Maybe it will. So like I think it's, speaking of running toward complexity, like it's fascinating and complex in so many different directions. Like I think it's touching everything else we cover. And so I'm thinking about AI all the time. We have very strict guidelines at The Atlantic, and the thing that we talk about all the time is that we are a magazine for humans, made by humans, and that is it's like a sacred promise that we're making to readers, that we're thinking aloud, or we're writing, but I think of it as thinking aloud. Like we're doing this together, and it is a human endeavor, and that is what makes it valuable. Like I couldn't imagine asking someone to subscribe to something that we've outsourced our own thinking on. That being said, there are, like AI, it's such a broad term, and so there are a bunch of ways this technology can be used that might actually be helpful. I'll give you one example. We have a tool that we use that is basically, an AI helps us listen to a bunch of podcasts. So we have, we made a whole list of various there's so many podcasts, there's too many podcasts, but they're often, and I won't do too much of a digression into politics, but a lot of important, powerful political figures have sort of stopped trying to deal with journalists and instead just have their own podcasts. And so no one journalist can listen to all of these podcasts, but there are newsworthy things happening and being said on them, and we feel it's our obligation to keep up with, certainly people who are elected officials who are on podcasts. And so we have this tool that AI, it's a sort of a corpus of podcasts, and you can set up alerts to say, like, let's say that I want to write a story about Melville. Not the highest stakes thing, maybe, but that I could enter a search term into this tool and say, like, send me an email anytime any one of these 100 podcasts mentions Melville. So all of which is to say, like, there are uses of AI for research or maybe streamlining operational things that are, I think, acceptable and not don't get in the way of the thinking and the writing. But we feel very strongly that this is a human-made magazine, and that's what it needs to be.
Yeah, I mean, like with any new technology or tool, right? It's how you use it and who uses it and to what end, right? I am struck, kind of as you're describing the podcast landscape too, right? Of all of the noise, I think there's accessibility, increased accessibility to information, right? In all these different streams, but it can be hard to find things in the same way. So,
yeah. And I will say too, so the one very public-facing use of AI that I have genuinely mixed feelings about, but fall on the side of like, okay, this wouldn't exist if we didn't have it, is we do have an AI voice narrate most of our articles. So if you want to listen to narrated articles, it's an AI voice, which is like not my favorite thing, although they're very convincing. But it's something where we wouldn't have we wouldn't have the staffing to narrate all of our own articles without that. And so when you're making the calculus, it's like, okay, speaking of things that our readers want, people say they really want this. They like to be able to listen while they're like walking their dog or doing the dishes or whatever. And so, okay, we couldn't provide it without this tool, fine, we'll do it, but it does pay me a little bit.
That's great. So you touched on this a little bit, but can you talk a little bit more about what brought you to Moby-Dick Marathon at the museum, and what those impressions were, so what that experience was?
I don't remember. I heard about it from, I was almost certainly a colleague at the Atlantic, and I had never known about it, and someone was like, oh yeah, there's this museum that does this marathon reading over the course of 30 hours, and I just immediately was like, that's awesome, I need to go to that. Like, that's just such an amazing idea. I just was immediately captivated. And dragged my whole family. This is my kid's second time at this museum in the past several months, and they love it too. And as I was saying, it's just, I mean, the idea, I find just like tremendous, it's just beautiful, this idea that so many people would come together around this ancient novel, and feel moved enough, especially as your colleague was saying, like, it's really cold here in January. And it's just, I found it to be honestly the most like uplifting, beautiful experience I've had since, I just can't speak highly enough about it. I think the idea that like literature and literature by a long dead writer is worth coming together in person, in real time, regardless of the conditions outside, and to be, it's really like, I don't know, I can't even articulate how beautiful I think it is, but it's one of the most special events I've ever been to in my life.
That's great. And just by a show of hands, how many in our audience have been to Marathon and had the same
It's just the best.
Okay. Yay. Okay, so can you tell me a little bit about kind of what's happening at the Atlantic right now, what you're thinking about at the journal, what you have on deck kind of in the next few months and the coming years? Like, what is the shape of the current kind of content, and where you imagine you're going?
Yes, so we are growing, which is very exciting. We're hiring a lot, which is a great responsibility and privilege. And some of it is more of the same. So in the sense of just, we want even more robust books coverage, or, we certainly need more hands on deck to cover this political moment, which is extremely chaotic. And so we're thinking a lot. I mean, I live in Washington, D.C. We're split about 50-50 between New York and D.C. So we're thinking a lot about how to meet the political moment. It's an extraordinarily urgent and complicated story, so it's a big part of what we do. But we're also always thinking about sometimes people think of The Atlantic as just a political magazine, and we're really not. We're a general interest magazine. We care deeply about literature ever since our founding, and culture for that matter. And so something that I'm always thinking about too is like, okay, how do we simultaneously meet the political moment, which is urgent and time sensitive, but also give something to our readers that really speaks to sort of the depth of the human experience, if we're not all just only political creatures. And so really like creating a mix of coverage that hits different emotional registers, that asks really deep, timeless, sort of big questions about humanity and our place in the world or the universe, but also then covers the latest whatever is happening politically or culturally. And so we're growing. I think if I had to get more specific than that, I mentioned our cover story about the end of reading, but this is a preoccupation of ours, is the importance of reading in a literary life, and how we as a magazine can advance the cause of reading is a big one for us. I think just trying to understand what is happening to our democracy is huge. I mean, that's something that we're talking about constantly, and so looking ahead to midterms in 2028, we're actively planning coverage around that. And then from there, I mean, I think it's also a big one for us is just, and this is Melvillian, I would say, is really thinking deeply about America's changing place in the world, and a lot of that is geopolitical, but also cultural and technological. And so, from our founding, one of the reasons the Atlantic exists is to sort of try to figure out, we talk about the American idea, and no generation of Atlantic editors has really defined what that means. Like we're trying to define that, or sort of wrestle with the question of what does it mean to be American through all of our coverage. And so that's always sort of like the overlay on everything we're doing.
That's great. I have sort of two different follow-ups there. I think one, I'm curious to hear you speak about, if you would, kind of the the way culture and art gets folded into the kind of content that you're developing, and sort of what your thoughts are on how that's balanced in the journal.
Yeah, do you mean like cultural coverage or like actually like art as in photography itself or both? Okay. Well, yeah, so it's not covering culture right now. I mean, it's so funny. This is maybe like presentism on my part because it's always complicated, right? Like even in Melville's time, the world felt too fast for people. And so, but no, I mean, the change, one of the dominant changes we talk about with our team that covers culture, meaning books, television, movies, et cetera, and sort of just the intersection of like culture and daily life is the decline of the monoculture. So over the past 25-ish years, going from this time where there were X number of channels on television and everybody gathered around the water cooler and talked about the same cultural things for the most part, or if you had some niche interest, you like had to work really hard to find your fellow fandom or community. Now, like with the internet in particular, it's totally collapsed, geographic demarcations. It makes it very easy to find your people, for better or worse. Like if it's because you're a fan of an awesome band, like fun. If it's because you're an extremist, not so great. So like all of this gets sort of folded back into what's happening culturally and what we even think about as what culture is. And so this is something that we're thinking about all the time in our coverage of occasionally you have these moments like, The Odyssey comes to mind as something that, oh, there is a movie that comes out and everyone seems to be talking about it. But more often than not, it's just extraordinarily fractured, and that's interesting and complicated. And then I don't mean to go on, but I can talk about, in terms of art in the magazine itself, and we sort of infamously resisted any illustration for many, many years. So in Melville's age, this is this really robust period of lots of different magazines springing up, and many of them are illustrated. This is pre-photography, but illustrated magazines were a whole thing, and you can probably envision some of these old sort of like beautifully Rococo, like just like there's beautiful illustrated magazines from the late 19th century. The Atlantic was like, no, we're only doing words. We care about reading, which of course you can tell that I still am a little bit leaning in that direction. And similarly, we love art and photography, and we have a great team of artists who make our website look beautiful and make the print magazine look beautiful. But we also, we are devotees of the written word, and we tend to be less visual. I mean, we have a TikTok account, we do all of the social web stuff, but it really, over many, many generations, we've been more words than pictures.
Yeah, and for those that are curious, there are some copies of Harper's Weekly and Godey's Ladies Magazine just downstairs when you come out of the elevator in that hallway. So you can see some of the publications that were competing along with the Illustrated London News and other circulating periodicals in the 19th century on view right here at the museum.
I should mention one other thing, which is we are, as we're growing, we are expanding our coverage of fine arts, and that is very much by design at this moment where, we've talked a lot about, like, we should have people who write about opera for us, even though it's a declining art form, or ballet for that matter, or and we have a really brilliant art critics. We've just hired Sebastian Smee, who is writing beautifully for us, Susan Tallman. I just have to shout out my brilliant colleagues who writes about visual arts. And we've started and I think it's in this magazine, but we've started a back of the magazine, like the last page is basically like a closer look at a painting. So every month we'll take a painting and Susan writes brilliantly about what you should notice about it, and I love it.
Oh, that's great, and it's great to hear about Sebastian Smee because so many other desks are getting rid of culture writers. And so that's really important to grow. I also was thinking about, as you were talking, the challenge then of identifying or really speaking to a zeitgeist, and the note that you made earlier about a lot of the conversations you're having in the editorial room about like what does it mean to be an American magazine, or what is an American kind of identity. And I think that's a really interesting thing I'd love to chat a little more with you about, because it does feel like at certain moments, right, in the past, you could kind of identify these sort of arcs, right? And as things fracture, it becomes harder to pinpoint what's important, what's historical, or what's noise. And I'll just add anecdotally here at the museum, our mission and mandate is to collect the experiences and history of this region. And contemporary collecting is often the hardest collecting, like contemporary history. What is happening right now that needs to be collected and preserved for the future. And that feels like a little bit in parallel with kind of what you're describing.
Yeah, that's so interesting to have you put it that way. I mean, there are definitely moments. I can mention, we have a story coming out in the next issue about threats to election integrity. It's a really important story, and we had a debate over, should we put this in print, which would mean waiting a little bit to, just because of the realities of putting things on paper, it takes a little bit longer than putting them on the internet, or should we rush and do it faster? And one of the parts of that conversation was, I really felt strongly that we owe it. I mean, I look through archival, I'm a huge Atlantic nerd, obviously, but like I love to go back and read news archives. I think it's like a really important part of the historic record. And so routinely we're making decisions like, you know what, this needs to be in print because yes, it's a magazine and people might throw it away after they read it, but like just some degree more of permanence, or like something for the historic record. Not that, you know, we carefully preserve our digital record as well, but sometimes it is like, no, this needs to be in print because future people who care to look back at the Atlantic need to know that this was something we were thinking about right now.
And I think, as an aside, the Atlantic and Oliver Wendell Holmes have shout-outs in 2 of our exhibitions right now. In the hallway where the Harper's is, in reference to his article in the Atlantic about the Civil War and about looking at Civil War photography and sort of putting it in a drawer to sort of be able to bury your dead. And then in Marina's extraordinary photography exhibition, talking about mirrors as memories, which...
Well, and I'm so glad you mentioned Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was one of our founders at the Atlantic and the father of the Supreme Court Justice of the same name, I think. But anyway, he was a neighbor of Melville's, and actually was Melville's doctor when Melville lived in Western Mass. So, and if you've read Melville in Love, which is an extraordinary book that I love and would highly recommend, it advances this idea that Melville was secretly in love with his neighbor in the Berkshires, who also Oliver Wendell Holmes maybe had a thing for, so there's a lot of intrigue there.
Very exciting. Well, since you mentioned that book, can you tell us a little bit about what you read? You are an editor, and I can only imagine you are like reading every day, and probably, especially if it's drafty stuff, like maybe hard stuff to read, right? Like reading is work for you. So what do you read?
I do read constantly. I read a lot of journalism, obviously, and I'm reading a lot of drafts, definitely. But I also, I mean, I occasionally will go through periods where it's extremely newsy and it's just the demands of my job mean that I like, a couple months will go by and I'll realize I haven't read a novel, and then I'll read one and be like, what was it? Like, oh my gosh, novels are so good. So I mean, not just for my own nourishment of my literary soul, but I do think there's something you get out of novels in particular that just is unmatched by any other kind of reading. But I read everything as much as I can get my hands on, and read, when I can't sleep, I literally do read old newspaper archives just because I think they're interesting. I like nonfiction a lot, but I do love novels. What did I most recently? I read, the last 2 novels I read were, the last nonfiction I read was Melville in Love, which I really did love. And then I recently read American Fantasy, which I won't even bother with recapping it, but it was fun. It took a couple days. And then Flesh, which just won the Booker Award, which I would really highly recommend. It was really a really good novel.
That's great. Can I pivot and ask you a couple sort of more personal questions?
Of course.
Can you tell me sort of what the first book was that made you fall in love with reading?
Oh my gosh, that's such a good question. It was probably something my parents read to me that I don't even remember, honestly. I feel like there's just something about being read aloud to when you're a child that is like, it burrows into you and never leaves. But The Velveteen Rabbit comes to mind. I really loved that one as a child. Sylvester and the Magic Pebble was a favorite. There's so many. I love children's literature too. And on whale themes, Amos and Boris is also a great one.
That's great. And so then what was your sort of pathway? Like, when did you discover that you could have a career in reading?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's also, I would say, a career in asking questions. So the short anecdote is my first real job after babysitting, which is also a real job, but my first job where I worked at a place was at a coffee shop called Juice and Java in suburban Philadelphia. And I remember one of my bosses there, who seemed really old at the time, but was like 25 probably. I was like 14, yeah, ancient. He, I think, was exasperated by me because I was asking a bunch of questions. And he finally was like, very sweetly but sternly, was like, Adrienne, if you can find a job someday where you just ask questions, you will do fine. And I think that's one of these things where I remember it now, and I'm like, oh, he was right. I don't know that actually propelled me toward journalism, but But yeah, I always loved writing, and I guess I didn't really know how one would go about writing a book or anything. So I was sort of like, oh, I'll major in journalism. And then I thought I wanted to be a journalist because I loved writing. And then when I started reporting, I learned that I love reporting, and that just the sort of public service aspect of it, the idea that you are charged with asking questions on behalf of your fellow citizens, and you have to, confront powerful people, and they might yell at you, but it's a worthy cause. Like I really, I'm just drawn to that and feel that it's a total privilege to be the person who has to represent others in a democracy and say, like, no, we need an answer to this, or to push for transparency and truth. I think I obviously would say this as a journalist, but just something that I take very seriously. And so basically that was the thing that kept me going. I early in my career, I thought I wanted to be a sports journalist and had a lot of fun going to a lot of games for a while, and then felt like I wanted to do something that got me a little closer to the democratic action. So.
Yeah. And thinking a little bit more about that, I'm curious if you have thoughts about, journalism is so much focused, right, on relaying a story to an audience in a way that's accessible, and novels sometimes aren't. So going back to that question about Melville and sentence structure and did he love his audience? I'm not sure how much he was thinking about his reader. Can you share a little bit about your thoughts between maybe the difference between a novelist and a journalist?
Absolutely. So it's interesting. I think about this a lot in terms of a newspaper journalist versus a magazine journalist, which is a little bit of a made-up category, especially in a world where all of these forms converge. But from my own experience as someone who went from newspapers to magazines, I really had to train myself away from I was a City Hall reporter. And so when you're a City Hall reporter, you're trying to get scoops, competing with your other reporters, and your job, your writerly job, is to put the sort of it's like maximum density of information and explanation up high. And there's really no other consideration. You might tell yourself that you're focused on the writing, and some newspaper writers are, of course, brilliant and wonderful writers. But the mission is, here's the newest information, here it is up top, and here's all it's just density of information.
Like the forward title, right? When you get the digest of do I understand what the story is from this packed word?
Right, exactly. Whereas, so the difference with a magazine, and then I'll get to a novel, is often, and we talk a lot about this at The Atlantic, that you want your lead or the first, sentence, paragraph, couple paragraphs of your story to hook the reader. And sometimes the best way to do that isn't to tell them everything at once. Sometimes you want to sort of slowly unfurl a story and surprise them with something later that if you were writing for a different publication, you'd put it all up front. And then with a novel, I think similarly, obviously first there's the distinction of it being fictional, so that's a key distinction. But similarly, it's I do think of it, and this can sound a little highfalutin, so forgive me, but I do think of it as a different form of truth seeking. And I feel this way when I've read a novel that I love, that there are just some forms of art or human expression that access truth that can't be accessed any other way. I feel that way. Live music and novels can do something that journalism can't, and that's fine. They play different roles, but it's all truth seeking, but in different vehicles.
Yeah, I love that. I think about that too, right, with visual art. It can kind of unlock something that you don't really realize, and even if somebody says it quite clearly or transparently, it might land differently.
Yeah,
it's
totally.
in different form. Well, I do want to, thinking about questions, open it up to our audience if people have questions that they'd like to pose.
That's the quite your lad.
Thank you.
Eyes. See the colors towards the bread. And you're the best Greek bread that British companies heading to heavyweight subjects.
Did everyone hear that?
No.
Oh, okay. I subscribe to The Atlantic.
Yay.
You know what I did? Because I subscribed to Apple News, and I found myself gravitating towards it when plus I was only matter God was grow up. Well, used to, and the Reese's. Anyway, so a few months ago, the cover story was the best free bread in America. So I had to take a double take on Atlantic. So I'm just curious how that evolved.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked. And if anyone hasn't read this, obviously I would recommend it, but really I can't recommend it highly enough. It's an amazing article by Katie Weaver, who's hilarious and utterly brilliant. We had a real debate over that. And so it's true that we at the Atlantic have a reputation for being like serious and important, and we try to be, and we are, I hope. But we also are a collection of weird, creative people. And I sometimes worry that that sort of weirdness or eclecticness doesn't always come out, and it should. It's part of being a magazine. That cover story. So first of all, it's brilliant, and it's not. It is about free bread. It's not really, but it's also. You'll read it. I hope it's deeper than that ultimately. But we did have this really robust debate editorially of like, are our subscribers going to think we're insane that we set like we have like serious democracy covers, and then it's like the April cover is pink and about bread. So we knew that it would be received with some surprise, but we also, and this was, I should point out too, right as the Iran war was starting. And it sort of felt like even more of a swerve, like Iran's happening and hey, bread, hey everybody. And so we of course are covering the Iran war and were at the time, but there were two things there. One, that was such a fast moving conflict that it was actually quite hard to imagine how to get it onto the cover in a way that wouldn't be overtaken by events by the time, it's only a 3-week turnaround cycle between the printing press and the magazine coming out, but that's still, a lot can happen in 3 weeks. But more than that, this was really about like, okay, we're gonna do this swerve. Some people will be surprised, but hopefully they'll read it and like it. I don't know if you did yet, I'll be curious what you think. Okay, but it really is more about the literary part of our roots, that Katie, the woman who wrote that story, is just so brilliant and original and funny, and unlike, she has a writerly tone unlike anyone else, not just at the Atlantic, but anywhere, I would argue. And so it was sort of like, okay, in her hands, like she did something that we sometimes talk about, which is she wrote her way onto the cover, where if you write something that is just so captivating, even if it's not what we would normally put on the cover, like let's do something surprising and a little strange. And so we went for it, and hopefully people liked it.
I think Beatrice is going to come with a mic, I believe. If people will wait for that, we are recording so we can hear your question.
I was interested in you mentioning the articles being transcribed into audio. I guess that's the right way. And the fact that many people listen to podcasts now, listen to things on audio, and probably wouldn't even read some of the articles in the magazine if you didn't do it. And the difference between reading and listening, I love audiobooks. I just finished reading Rudyard Kipling's Kim in both audio and my Kindle as I could get to it. But it seems that there's a different process in the brain for looking at the written word, which is abstract symbols, which we interpret as sounds, which we put together as words, which we then put together as sentences, and your brain has to be doing something different when it's reading and when it's listening to the same exact text being read to you. How do we get people to continue reading? The world goes the way it goes, and if they don't want to read, they're not going to. But what are your thoughts on, is it important that people continue to read and not simply take it all in as audiobooks?
I mean, I think it is, but with some caveats. Like, there are all kinds of reasons why someone might not be able to read text on a page, and so like I think I want to acknowledge that. I also love audiobooks. It's funny, I find myself, I'm not sure what your experience is, but I like listening to nonfiction audio. With a novel, I still really just love to hold the book. I can't even, like Kindle, same thing. Nonfiction is fine, but for whatever reason, there's something about a novel in your hand for me. But so I do think, this is where we need like a cognitive scientist or linguist or both on this panel. I would love to hear someone who actually knows the answer to the question about what's happening in your brain, because I'm sure there's interesting stuff there. And actually it would be a really good story for the Atlantic, so maybe we should assign that. But my attitude sort of culturally is, if people should absorb stories the way they want to, and reading doesn't have to be for everyone, but I think it's important certainly for some number of us, and as long as there's like, I wouldn't want to be overly precious about it from a brain science perspective, most of all because I don't know, but I find personally there is a different experience. There's something different happening when you're reading versus listening.
Just one follow-up comment is, when I read Moby-Dick about 25 years ago, and I got a big copy of it that had a lot of commentary as well. I didn't have arthritic hands, and now the Kindle is really valuable. Sometimes
There's all kinds of reasons.
Pros and cons. I much prefer to have a book, and I'm one of those people who writes in the margins and underlines things and all of it.
Yes.
Appreciate your comments on it.
And anecdotally, certainly, I can say from having taught in university and been taught how to teach, there are lots of studies that describe that kind of really actually processing through writing is so important, right? So taking notes while you're listening to things, taking notes while you're reading, that is a processing part of kind of making sense of what's in front of you. So, yeah.
This conversation made me think of two things happening when I was in grad school in 1968 at Columbia when we were out in the rebellions. And the first thing is I was trying to decide on a dissertation topic. And I chose Moby-Dick, and we said, you can't do that. There's nothing new to say about that.
Well, I think you proved them wrong. This is one of our Melville scholars if you dropped out.
The other thing is with content span. We were in the middle of a Melville seminar, and Quentin Anderson was a brilliant teacher, and we had to start meeting in professors' homes because the school itself was shut down. And Conference Man was the first book we read in his home, but we didn't discuss it in his home because he said, I can't read this book. So there's your...
Okay, so my colleague is not alone in that. That's good to know.
Yeah.
Anyone else have a question? You may end up with a byline in the Atlantic, right? Like this gentleman here, so make it a good one.
I wondered if you can think of a piece that you published, that you approved, that the response was something you never expected, and how you felt.
Yeah, that's a great. There definitely have been cases. I think. I usually, we very often are publishing things that we know will provoke a reaction, and so it's usually the case that we're carefully thinking through, especially for something that's more like maybe a provocative argument or whatever, that we're thinking through. Just first of all, looking around every corner to make sure that it's fair and obviously accurate and all the rest. So luckily we're not usually surprised, but definitely have been. I'll give one example of a piece that I wrote, which was I've written about political violence for some time. And whenever I write about it, it provokes a lot of reaction just because it's such an important and high stakes topic, of course, but it's one of those topics where it's like you're almost guaranteed to make everybody mad at you. And so yeah, I wrote a piece, I'm not even remembering if this was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, but basically arguing that no one, and this to me, I was thinking like this is a very standard argument, but making the argument that like no one should cheer on political violence regardless of your political differences, and that like my view is that we should always endeavor to solve our differences nonviolently. There's obviously a huge, corpus of literature or sort of there's a robust debate to be had about whether and when violence is necessary to enact change. So, like, of course, taking that into account, but that was one where, especially in this time where people are very worried about fascism and all the rest, I think I was surprised by just how virulent people were against the idea that nonviolence is something that you should aspire to. I understand why people have strong reactions, but that was one where I was just the tenor of the reaction surprised me a bit.
They maybe weren't drinking from the same trough.
But I do logical diversity. We like it.
Any questions?
Hi. I really like heroic journalists' movies.
Me too.
And I'm wondering, and I'm thinking of All the President's Men or the one with the Boston Globe reporters. Spotlight. Who exposed the scandals of the Catholic Church. Is there a moment in your tenure at the Atlantic or in the history of the Atlantic that you remember where heroic journalism was necessary to fight against the publisher, to fight against the market forces or the administration? Or
That's such a nice question. I also love those movies. I would never claim heroism on my own part, but we do take very seriously our commitment to the public to ask tough questions, to hold public officials to account. One example that comes to mind for me is definitely the craziest story I've ever worked on, which was what has come to be known as Signalgate. And so just navigating this question of just for those who may not know the story, our editor-in-chief, my boss, was inadvertently added to a group chat with the nation's top national security officials while they were planning to attack Yemen, or an attack in Yemen. And so that was one where the layers of complexity were profound. It was unlike any other story I've ever edited. It also, there was a question first of like, is this, like, what is this? Is this real? I, for the first few days of being this chat, was like, you're totally getting hacked or something. Like, this cannot be real. And then as it became clear that it was, it became, we started shifting into questions of, how do we tell the story responsibly? How do we vet whether it's true what we're even seeing? And how do we protect our journalists? How do we make sure we can publish if the FBI shows up in our newsroom? And so there are all sorts of, that was probably the most complex story in recent memory. And I do think, I'll give credit to my editor-in-chief here, that, there was a group of us talking through what to do, and a million lawyers who wanted to advise us, which was very helpful, but lawyers and journalists tend to have different approaches and risk tolerance. And so I do see it as heroic that we published that story, because it would be very easy to come up with reasons not to and to be scared. And we have to be fearless in this moment, and we owe it to our subscribers and our fellow citizens to be fearless. And so that's something we talk about and think about a lot.
Two different professions that ask lots of questions. And when you were saying two roads diverged in a wood. Okay. Do we have other questions from our audience?
So,
Okay.
This is just a general question, but I came to this event from, this is a general question. I came from Chicago for this event, and I'm wondering who else is from out of town, where people came from in general.
That's a great question. Who traveled? Who traveled to come here? Where did you come from?
Washington.
Oh, man. Somewhere else. New Hampshire. Eugene? New York.
Rhode Island.
Rhode Island. Kentucky? Connecticut.
Minneapolis?
Minneapolis. Ooh.
You think?
And Minneapolis wins.
Is there another question back here? You? Yeah.
That's it. Maybe it's because I'm just an old, retired business dean, but the story of the Atlantic is, to me, incredible. 170 years, thousands of magazines have come and gone over that period. And maybe this has already been a Harvard Business School case study, but how has the Atlantic survived? I know there's not one issue, and isn't it a group of great publishers and editors or whatever? Look at the magazine. Look at the back cover. It's not an advertisement. How can you survive and how succeed as you have? Do you understand that?
I think so. I mean, I can't speak to the period before me. I mean, I can speak to it intellectually, and I love and care about the history of magazines. It could probably bore you with too much history. For the Atlantic's history, I mean, the real key for us was actually just in the past 7 years. So when I joined in early 2014, we didn't have a paywall, and so we were fully ad-supported, meaning that our entire business model survived on for the internet on clicks at a time, meaning that the ad revenue is generated by people clicking on stories and then seeing those ads. In many cases, programmatic ads. And so that model worked for a time, but really relies on the scale of the audience. So in a world where, Facebook and Google are sending lots of people to your website, it can look like a healthy business model, but for a number of reasons was not. And so in 2019, we decided to put up a paywall, we debated it really extensively. There are still mixed feelings in the sense that there was this with the internet, since the 1990s, people have come to view information as rightly, freely accessible. But the truth is it requires full-time paid professionals to do journalism. And so the way I think about it is we right-sized our business model such that we said, okay, we're going to make the highest quality magazine. We're trying to do that. We're always trying to push ourselves to be more ambitious and better. And we know that that's expensive, and we're going to ask people to pay us for it. And at times, during the pandemic, for instance, we did take down our paywall. We have certain standards for things where we think if it's in in the immediate interest of public health, for instance, we might say that anybody should be able to access an article. But for the most part, we're asking subscribers to support us, and that has really been the difference that makes a difference. That's by far our revenue model now, and so we wouldn't exist without our subscribers. That was, by the way, our business model when we started as well. I mean, we've had ads throughout the course of our history, but it's really the existence of The Atlantic is based on not just the commitment of the people making it over many generations, but the commitment of people who want to read it. And so it's up to us to come up with something people want to read, but it's really our subscribers. That's all there is to it. We couldn't exist without our subscribers.
And I think that's also the museum model, right? It's the community, right? Our members are what help us to thrive as well. So that's, I think, a really lovely way of thinking about the many that contribute to a shared mission and the continued existence of really important institutions like the Atlantic and, if I may, the New Bedford Williams.
See, I told you we're kindred spirit.
Well, these are wonderful questions from the audience. I would just turn it back to you if there's anything we haven't touched on that you want to share in closing, and then we'll be able to take a little break, I believe, before the next panel.
No, I just want to say thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone to support this museum and the Atlantic, and it's been a pleasure to be with you all today.
Well, thank you for traveling from DC with family to come join us. Yeah.